from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Welcome to Pathways to Pediatrics, a special series of Pediatrics on Call. I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie.
And I'm Dr. David Hill. In Pathways to Pediatrics, we get to meet people in our profession and find out how they got to and through pediatrics.
It's our way of shining light on the achievements of others and offering some inspiration.
Joanna, let's take a trip down memory lane to our first real podcast episode. Do you remember how nervous we were?
Oh, yes, I do. Released June 25th, 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, the only thing that calmed me down was our guest, Dr. Ben Hoffman, who was so good at talking about drowning prevention that we barely had to interview him.
Which is probably why we brought him back for other episodes on injury prevention. Now, I don't know how much credit we can take for this, but as of January 1st, our esteemed podcast guest, Dr. Hoffman, took over as AAP President.
I mean, I think we could take at least a little credit. But Ben is more than just a great podcast guest. He's a father, a husband, an advocate, and so much more.
In fact, in addition to serving as president of the AAP, Dr. Hoffman is a pediatrician at the Dornbecker Children's Hospital at OHSU in Portland and vice chair for community health and advocacy for the Department of Pediatrics, as well as medical director of the Tom Sargent Safety Center. Ben, welcome back.
It's been so long. I'm so excited to be here. I've missed you so.
We missed you too. And we want to talk about how you care for children and your job as a pediatrician, but we wanted to start with what it was like for you as a child. You grew up in New Mexico and your father was an experimental physicist. Your mother was a realtor. How did you wind up becoming a doctor?
Oh, until I was 15, I was convinced I was going to be a marine biologist. I wanted to study dolphins and whales and all that sort of stuff. A little bit challenging being in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Indeed. I actually had a crazy opportunity in between my sophomore and junior year of high school to go on a scientific expedition with folks from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And I spent a month on a boat off the coast of Guatemala doing, actually, it was a geophysics project. But I got to meet a lot of people who did work in marine biology and learned that it is a very challenging field. There are not a lot of openings. And I decided after that I needed to think about something a little more practical. And I had always gravitated towards teaching. I'd always gravitated towards things with kids. I coached soccer. I reffed soccer when I was in high school. I babysat a lot. And I had a pediatrician who I just adored, who really became a role model for me. He joined the one pediatric practice in our town when I was in early high school. He just finished his residency at University of Arizona. So he was this young, really bright, really energetic, just role model. And I had the opportunity to talk to him about what his life was like, learned that pediatrics was a lot more than I thought it was. You know, I had asthma when I was a kid. I ended up in the ER with, lacerations and fractures and stuff like everybody else. And so I had interaction with the healthcare system, but didn't really understand it. And the idea of blending doing great things for kids with science, which is what those were really my passions, it all sort of came together. So when I went off to college, I was pretty sure I was going to be a pediatrician. That was my intent.
So, Ben, I have to ask the Oppenheimer question. This was Los Alamos we're talking about. Did your dad make things go boom?
No, he worked on elementary particles, so nothing that had any relevance to weapons. It was solely basic science, like the most basic science.
That's still fascinating to me.
It's totally fascinating. I did work in the plutonium facility for 3 summers.
And was there ever a threat that you would become an experimental physicist instead of a physician?
There was never even the slightest hint of a threat because math is my kryptonite. It is very clear, from my dad and his colleagues that my brain did not work the way their brains did. So I liked a lot of the concepts. I learned a lot from my dad. And he was very good at being able to translate what he did and trying to explain it in English, but I'd be lying if I said I really understood it.
Now, speaking of your family, you grew up with a biological brother and 2 adopted sisters. And then you identify as Jewish, but you were raised in a community with very few other Jewish families. How did that experience growing up with your siblings and this family shape your mission as a pediatrician?
Wow. So we moved to Los Alamos, New Mexico when I was 8. My brother was 6, and my sisters were 4. My sister Julie, who's African-American, joined our family when she was 6 months old. And we were living in New Jersey at the time. We were the second family in New Jersey to adopt interracially. My sister Carrie was 3.5 when she came from Korea, speaking not a word of English. And when we went to Los Alamos, a town of 17,000, very politically conservative, very Caucasian, people didn't know what to make of us. There was a news story, the local newspaper came and did a story on us within the first month or so, I think mostly to warn the community, like, oh goodness, these folks are here. Just because it was so, I just saw my sisters for the holidays, and we were talking about the fact that, Julie was one of 4 African-American kids in the high school. Carrie was one of 3, I think, Asian kids in her class. And, we were one of 17 or 18 Jewish families in Los Alamos. And so it took a while. We definitely were victims of some hate. I was beaten up for being Jewish. People used a lot of horrible language around my sisters. My parents were phenomenal, and just, that's the way they're going to do it. If they're that mean and that horrible, you're not going to change that. So just let it go. We're better than that. We're stronger than that. And it's not okay, but we have to let it go. And I think a lot of that experience led all of us kids, to learn how to fight for justice. I'm a pediatrician. My brother's a pediatrician. He's a pediatric pulmonologist at Seattle Children's. My sister Julie's a medical social worker, and my sister Carrie is a special ed teacher. So we all found niches where we were translating our experiences into advocacy for kids, which is really kind of cool.
And when you guys met recently, do any of those experiences kind of stick out? Are there stories that you still think about from that time, even though it was very difficult and you've tried to let it go?
Yeah, I remember one day walking to school with the 4 of us, and a bunch of older kids starting to yell the N-word, and Julie bursting into tears, and us just sort of surrounding her, putting our arms around each other and continuing to walk on to school. I also remember one experience with scouts very early on. I was a scout for 2 weeks. The second week, it was my turn to bring the cookies, and I went to the meeting at somebody's house, and the activity for the day was making Christmas ornaments. And so they had stuff set out on the table, and, kids sat down and started doing things. And they said, oh no, Ben, you're going to go in the kitchen and you're going to make Hanukkah ornaments. And so I went to the kitchen, sat for a minute, and then I went and got the cookies and left. And I never went back.
Wow. This reflects on some experiences that I had in my own life growing up in a Jewish family in Memphis, Tennessee. So I may need a second to process that.
Yeah, it's also a good reminder.
Yeah.
I try to always say happy holidays, knowing that it's unclear what holidays people celebrate or if they even do. So I think that's a good reminder coming off the holidays too.
Well, let's get out of Los Alamos here for a second and go from there, where you went to college at Berkeley, and then on to Harvard for medical school and Seattle Children's for residency. And you're all around the country at these huge academic institutions. And then You choose to leave the cities and academic medicine far behind and take your first job on a reservation with the Navajo Nation. What was it that led you to working for the Indian Health Service?
So I met my wife, Jane, in our freshman dorm at Berkeley. So we've been together forever. We actually just celebrated the 39th anniversary of our first date in October 6th. We've gone through everything together. We did college together. We did med school together. We couples matched in pediatrics. We were both very interested in global health and sort of the more public health aspects of pediatrics. And we were really hoping we would be able to do some international experience before we graduated from medical school. I had spent a couple of evenings shadowing a pediatrician at the Santa Fe Indian Hospital during the summers in college as I was interested in pediatrics. And so I got a chance to learn a little bit about some of the issues around Indigenous child health. Jane and I were not able to find an international opportunity in the 1 month that we had at the end of medical school together. And so we ended up spending a month in Crown Point, New Mexico at the Crown Point Indian Hospital, about 4 hours from where I grew up. And it changed our lives. We lived in this horrible mouse-infested trailer, but worked with the most amazing people, both the clinical staff and the patients and the families we worked with. We just fell in love with it. When we were in Seattle, we had a mentor, a guy by the name of David Grossman, who'd spent some time on the Navajo Nation in the beginning of his career, who was very influential in our decision as well as a number of our colleagues. And Jane and I had one call-free month in residency. We went back to the Navajo Nation, spent a month in Shiprock in the Four Corners, and knew that's what we needed to do. And in large part because of David Grossman, this amazing mentor, when we were in Gallup, New Mexico, there was another married couple from our residency class who we worked with there. And there were 10 other colleagues from Seattle Children's Residency who were scattered around the Navajo Nation. So it was very much it was part of the ethos of that program. So it was absolutely the right thing to do. And I can say without question, with all apologies to all my subsequent bosses and jobs, that will always be the best job that I ever had.
How long did you wind up working there?
So we were there for a little over 4 years.
And then what prompted you to kind of transition out of that space, given it was the best job that you've had?
Yeah, it was the best job. That's where I got bit by the injury prevention bug, where I fell into a career in injury prevention, specifically around starting with child passenger safety and car seats. But I missed teaching. And that's really what it came down to. We had some residents and some medical students who would come through. And every time I was working with them, I'm like, I love what I do, but I really miss this. And so I felt like I needed to get back to teaching. And a lot of what I wanted to teach was what I had learned about working with the community on the res around injury prevention and sort of engaging them in identifying and solving problems in an authentic way. So that my desire was to figure out how to teach pediatricians what I wished I had learned about community engagement and sort of bigger advocacy work.
And how did that work with Jane? Because she's also a pediatrician. She's got her own career goals. I think a lot of our listeners probably are in families that have 2 doctors. So, what is it like for you guys? And how did her career goals shift with you? And how do you make it work?
So I think it's always a lot of work, but it hasn't been that hard. We've been together so long. We've been together since we were 18. We sort of grew up as professionals together, until actually we left Navajo. We'd always worked in the same place. When I wanted to get back to teaching, Jane's desire was to become a primary care pediatrician, a medical home provider. We had 3 kids, and her hope was to work part-time so she could focus on being a mom. And we were really fortunate, or she was really fortunate, in that as I was recruited to the University of New Mexico, there was a community-based practice owned by two wonderful women, a private practice, who were looking for somebody to work 0.6 FTE. And so she joined that group and was with them for 11 years. And I think, in the same way that I really, really, really loved my time in academics at New Mexico, she was just so happy working with the practice that she worked with. It was a group of all moms who worked all part-time. They job shared seamlessly. They had an amazing staff. It was just about perfect. So we really lucked out in that way. She was generous enough, Jane was, to say, take the job at UNM if it feels like it's the right thing, and I'll make something work and it'll be okay. And it was.
So, Ben, earlier you mentioned your passion for injury prevention. I think you said that you fell into it. And we actually met each other long before the podcast when we were working together on a car seat safety campaign. I did not know at the time that one could be inducted into the National Child Passenger Safety Hall of Fame. But in fact, you are an inductee. Was there a particular event or series of events that drove this passion for you?
Yeah. I mean, I can unequivocally say there's no universe in which I ever would have thought, I'd become the car seat guy. But when you talk to people who are really engaged in advocacy, and that advocacy could be around, research and scholarship of a problem, or community engagement work, or systems and policy change, all good advocacy begins and ends with passion. And in my experience, the things that make you the most passionate or the most excited are problems that find you. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was on call in the winter of 1997. We took call one night a week and one weekend a month. And I basically had 5 call nights in a month where I got called into the emergency department to help stabilize a child who'd been critically injured in a car crash. None of those 5 were restrained at all. And after the 5th one, I remember standing in the ER just angry as hell, saying somebody has to do something about this, and knowing that I knew nothing about what to do. I didn't know about car seats. I didn't know about the law. I didn't know about AAP policy. I didn't know about the community. And I certainly didn't know how you affect change.
And so did the AAP teach you that?
Yeah. So one of the things I did when we were post-call, we had to be at work, but we didn't have clinical responsibilities. So I remember the next day, post-call, I don't think I slept that night, sitting at a computer. This was pre-Google. I think I used Alta Vista or one of those other early search engines. And I'm just starting to Google car seats. And I found AAP policy and I saw some articles. And there was this one name that came up over and over and over again in all of the car seat things, and it was Marilyn Bull. And so I emailed her, and literally 3 minutes after I sent off an email, I get an email back saying, here's my phone number, call me.
Wow.
And so, right, I'm like this dorky little pediatrician, recent grad, sitting in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, and I get it, and all of a sudden I'm talking to Marilyn Bull. It was like life-changing. And so she became an incredible mentor, sponsor, coach, guide, friend, and connected me to a bunch of other people, including folks within the AAP who do injury prevention. She helped me think through how to get connected to the infrastructure around car seats and occupant protection in the state and at the federal level, and taught me a lot about how to do the work. And that led to opportunities to connect with nonprofits and community-based organizations and advocacy groups. And it just sort of blossomed after that.
Speaking of blossoming, we cannot wait to see what you do with your AAP presidency. And how do you foresee this year will go? And what are you hoping people remember you for as president?
Wow, that's a good one. I think one of the things that I have learned about the leadership at AAP is that a lot of it is just, some of it, but you don't know what you don't know. And it's the stuff you don't know. We're heading into an election year. we're in a period where, we all know what things are like, both in terms of politics and healthcare and, all of this stuff. I anticipate doing a lot of work around firearms. I anticipate there's going to continue to be a lot of work that needs to be done around gender affirming care and around reproductive health. There's a ton of work, really exciting opportunities, I think, around healthcare financing and the way that we think about how we value the health of kids and how we operationalize that. I am really passionate about issues of equity and justice for kids in general and within the healthcare sphere. And I think we are within the AAP at a really fortunate time where the equity agenda has been front and center. We've just hired Dr. Joe Wright as the Chief Health Equity Officer, and there's a phenomenal staff. I'm really excited about helping advance that work and putting that front and center. I would love to help each of us figure out how we reignite our passion and how we harness our power as pediatricians. I think at NCE, Sandy Chung's plenary and the presentation that I gave at the business lunch both focused on the same thing, which was the power of pediatricians and this refrain that we're pediatricians, we're strong, we see the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And we all got into this game because we love kids, so we care about families and communities. And many of us find ourselves in situations now, practice or otherwise, where we've been pulled away from that. And that work, the work to make a difference for kids is not always valued in the way that we would hope it would be. And I think a lot of us feel disempowered. And I really want us to sort of take that back and reclaim the power that we have and utilize that to focus on doing great things for kids. And I think that's a lot of what sort of brought me to even the concept of running for AAP president. And, the experience that I've had in the last year as president-elect, sort of drinking from the fire hose and learning and getting to see so many of the things that happen behind the curtain have just reinforced all of those ideas, especially around us just becoming the force that we know we can be for justice, for, to do what's best for kids.
Well, Ben, speaking of our passion for pediatrics, we always want to know, before you go, what is it that you love most about being a pediatrician?
Relationships. As a primary care doc, to me, it's all about relationships. It's about relationships with kids and families and getting to watch them grow over time, getting to be a part of their lives. I mean, that's an incredible gift to be able to be a part of a family's life. And I look back to my experience with my pediatrician, and that's exactly how I felt towards him. He was a member of the family. I think it's about relationships with our peers and our colleagues, and that includes, our staff and everybody who helps us do the important work that we need to do. I think that's the thing that I love the most. And just knowing that day in, day out, without question, as a pediatrician, I know what my North Star is, and that's to do what's best for kids. And anytime I start to feel down, anytime I have a question about what the right thing to do is, I can go back to that. And I think we can all go back to that, because I think that's what brought us here.
Well, no one can question how passionate you are. And Dr. Ben Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast.
It's been a blast. Let's do this again. Let's play 2.
Yeah, definitely. I'm being told that's a baseball reference.
Oh, yeah, that's where that comes from. That's Ernie Banks.
What is an Ernie Banks, and what's the relevance?
Ernie Banks was a shortstop for the Cubs in the 60s. He hit 512 home runs, and he was just an ebullient, just force of life.
Great word.
And so one of his famous quotes was, as he's leaving the dugout, like, let's play two.
Okay.
And now we know that about you. To learn more about Dr. Hoffman and to listen to other pathways to pediatrics, find us at aap.org/podcast.
That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll look at a new clinical report on suicide risk and prevention.
We'll talk to the lead author, Dr. Mariah Ramondar. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.